Now, mini golf is a thing in my family. However, there are two kinds of mini golf holes that I find most challenging. The first is the volcano. This is the kind of shot that has a steep cone. So, if you hit it really hard, it goes up over the top of the hole and then down the other side. Ask me why I know. You can do that many times. You have to hit it just hard enough to get it to stay up on the top where it will actually go into the hole. When I focus too much on the height, I'm going up and down, up and down, up and down. My own private version of the claw. Now, I've also had a similar experience with the windmill shots. Now, in this case, you have a blade, and it's going around at a certain pace, and in some of them, there's also doors that open and shut as you're trying to time it, again, with exactly the right, level of effort to get it through the door, but not so hard that it bounces off the blade. Again, it's a matter of timing. And I might know that it's possible, for example, to hit it in such a way that it actually jumps over to the next lane, where children playing with their family can give you that really disparaging look. You might be wondering what volcano and windmill shots have to do with things like generosity and gratitude and hope. And the reason that I bring this up is because I think sometimes when we hear those terms, they sound a little bit like my first kind of shot, a little bit too over the top for some of us. Some of us think they don't really have enough force in them and you can't progress with those kinds of ideas. I see these terms used, as we all do, with too little rigor, and then they seem insipid or chirpy. And yet they may be among some of the most important survival skills in the coming months. For we're all seeing it again, my friends, where all of us are getting a little grumpy and snippy with each other because we're trying to take in, or maybe we're trying not to take in, and that actually makes it worse. The reality of a repeat election that we didn't want to have the first time, heartbreaking wars, the continued ill health and loss of beloveds, the politicization of our broken immigration system, frightening laws, including a new one in Missouri that is proposing to force women to marry when pregnant, and on and on. In these times, we have a choice that revolves around our faith. Do we take our by the way, I'm grateful for the sound of our youngest. However you want to bring it. Yes, thank you for giving us that joy in our service. But I do think in these times we have some choices, and the real choice becomes, do we take all of this into our hearts and try to figure out how to live with it in the ways we want to live? Or do we just take our marbles, go into our house, shut the doors? And I think that's a choice we're making every day. And I don't want to suggest that we don't need to take time for self-care. We do. But the struggle to maintain a true spirit of generosity in these times, in this sort of awful age, is something that I think needs to be the work of our collective endeavor here. The Article 2 Commission authorized by our Unitarian Universalist Association Board, as a number of us learned yesterday when we took a trip, either virtually or some of us in reality, to San Francisco on the day of the St. Patrick's Day Parade, learned yesterday. Thank you for that dedication. I know there's several here among us that did that journey. That commission incorporated much of what's in what we think of now as our 7 principles into this new proposed set of values. And yet there's one that, to me, when I read it and look at the principles, as I've been doing in the minister's class for this year, seems almost completely new to our expression of our faith, and it is the value of generosity. Generosity based on gratitude and hope. And I would propose to you that gratitude and hope are like the golf club swings with my least favorite shots. They require practice and balanced intentionality. Now, gratitude is perhaps one of the most important spiritual practices that people have. And what's amazing about gratitude is that a little goes a very long way. Like the mini golf stroke, it is something that you want to do where sometimes stronger and bigger isn't necessarily better, right? Certainly if you've got a windmill in front of you, that it does not always work. That's how you get to talk to the family in the next lane. That perfect little tap that gets the ball going just where you want it to go at just the right speed is what you need. And so for those days when it feels very hard to think about gratitude, it's important to realize we don't need that much. We can look around and see something that we haven't seen before with fresh eyes and be grateful in our world. Feel that positive surge of emotion and realize that life isn't as bad as it may feel in that moment. Perhaps a certain January 7th we felt that way. Perhaps there are many times that we read the news or open our apps and feel that way. But it's important to remember that we can be grateful. Now, Dan Gottlieb is a psychologist and author who also had a regular show on WHYY in Philadelphia for many years. And he has lived as a quadriplegic since he had a car accident when he was 33 years old. He's now in his 70s. And he speaks about the choice he has had to have so many times to cultivate gratitude. And this is not feel-good gratitude, folks. It includes times such as the day that he fell off a wheelchair ramp that they had built with a step at the end of it. And he thought he had forever lost the use of the arm, which was the only limb he had motion in. He said that it was times like that that he really had to make a choice about how he was going to see the world. And he also talks about the ways that others have made that choice and inspired him, including a woman he met when he was traveling in Africa who seemed especially joyful on the day he met her. So he asked her why she was so happy, and she replied that she was disabled and any day that her hut was cleaned was a good day. Far from simple-minded, what he saw was that she was open-hearted and had the wisdom to be able to take in what could give her a sense of gratitude. I think that our Article 2 Commission got it right. That gratitude really is at the heart of generosity. And what I'm talking about today is generosity of spirit, just to be clear. The kind of spirit that says, yes, times are hard, and I'm going to keep believing that I can make a difference, that we can make a difference, that the world matters. I'm going to keep doing that. I'm not going to shut all my doors. Except for those times when I need to come in to replenish, I'm going to keep myself connected to others and to the world, that kind of gratitude. If we have a theory of scarcity, what we're going to do in times of crisis is to retreat and go into our own little worlds and ignore everything around us. And in fact, we're going to get angered and bothered by those things around us that we don't want to focus on. That's just a reality. We're not going to be able to accept the gifts that are all around us, like the gifts, the musical gifts that were revealed unto us just this morning that we didn't expect. We all need times to ourselves, times to replenish and renew. Believe me, I plan to take some this afternoon. However, we also need to remember in that balancing how much we need to be connected to each other. And this brings me to the other part of what the Commission identified as at the root of our generosity, and that is hope. If we are not grateful and instead are resentful that life is not easy, even though we know that it is much harder everywhere in this troubled planet. We know that hope can be a form of spiritual bypass, a term which John Wellwood, a Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist, developed in the 1980s, and which he defined as a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. That's a lot. Unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. We don't want to use hope to avoid that. That's something we need to engage in. But by hope, I am not talking about the power of positive thinking, though it has its place. I'm speaking of something quite challenging, which is the sense that something is still possible, for our planet, for our climate, for our democracy, for each other, for our neighbors who are living without shelter, for our children who live in a world where there's too much threat, for our young adults who cannot have the economic opportunity that so many of us enjoyed, that there is hope, that there is possibility. For those that are struggling with addiction, for those who are struggling with their mental health, that there is hope for those who are feeling lonely and disconnected, that there is hope because we all have worthiness. That is the kind of hope I'm talking about, and that is not a spiritual bypass. Generosity and gratitude and hope are centered around love, and that takes work and practice. I don't like thinking that the troubles of this time will have something redemptive in them, said Pastor Jackie Lewis from Middle Church in New York. She preached this from a local synagogue in 2021 because the church that she pastors had just lost its building to a 5-alarm fire in the middle of the lockdown. Lewis pointed out, as she encouraged her congregation that had just suffered the loss of the building they had been in for more than 150 years, that the Jewish word for hope is tikva, binding together. How hopeful it would be if these times encourage us to come together rather than to be separate, if that was the redemptive peace that we found in the midst of these troubled times. A spirit of generosity requires us to remember that the opposite of love is not hate, it is fear. How many of you this week have felt fearful about something? I know I have. Yeah. We're living in a lot of fear. And so for us to make the active choice to still have generosity of spirit is a very deep and loving and expansive commitment. The author Terry Tempest Williams says, "The human heart is the first home of democracy. It is where we embrace our questions. Can we be equitable? Can we be generous? Can we listen with our whole beings, not just with our minds, and offer our attention rather than our opinion? And do we have enough resolve in our hearts to act courageously, relentlessly, without giving up, trusting our fellow citizens to join us in our determined pursuit of a living democracy?" In the minister's class this Wednesday, we will continue our conversation about what a spirit of generosity could mean for our collective action as people of faith in this world. I think it's also important for us to think about it as individuals. Generosity well played, I think, involves a couple things. First, it's what Buddhist teacher Tara Brach calls level setting our expectations. An example of this is the woman that Dan Gottlieb met, whose decision rule about whether a day was good or not was whether she had the time and energy to clean her hut. That's an expectation that can be met. Brach herself shared that she has to do this because she has a frightening development in her own health. And she said, "I thought I had to have physical activity. The stuff I used to love, like swimming and running, I found instead I could look at the leaves of the fern in my bedroom and be happy." Though it may seem odd, another grounding and regulating way to step into this idea of a spirit of generosity is through grieving. Brach talks about how we need to allow ourselves to grieve, to leave room for gratitude. When she was looking at the limits of her life touched by illness, she had to remember that her daily prayer was, "Please allow me to love this life no matter what. Please allow me to love this life no matter what. She had to give up her expectations of what life used to be to enjoy the life she had. And we can also view our interactions through this lens of abundance and hope. We may not be able to envision a world where people fleeing countries destroyed by our economic policies will have enough room to live all in single-family houses with large lots, and yet I think climate change is saying fewer and fewer of us should have that expectation anyway. We may not understand how we can have livelihoods that make sense for all people. We may be facing a world where it feels like it's all made up of volcano and windmill shots every day, and that's increasingly true as we approach this election season that feels difficult to handle. And yet it's important for us to remember that we can encourage one another and cheer one another on with a generosity centered around love. For that's what we are asked to do, to center our Unitarian Universalist values around love, which is, by the way, the opposite of fear. Right, thank you. I think these are the ways that we can use the nuance and balance of practices that allow us to find the right place and right way to use the spiritual tools, the same way we could, begin to moderate our mini golf shots. And by the way, Reverend Rodney and I are offering mini golf as part of the spring fling this year. I believe it's volcano and windmill free, but I have to go verify that. We all know that gardening and planting are also good ways to get grounded. So, if you, like me, need to focus on that spirit of generosity. We do need, in this time, to choose a vision of life that is expansive and inclusive and that affirms the trustworthiness of all that we see around us, the worthiness of all. Not that they will necessarily live into that potential, but our challenge is to see that they have that potential. I hope in these months to come that we will be the people of faith that hold both our own worthiness and the worthiness of others with whom we share this precious planet together. And may that be the sweet spot for us in the movement between generosity and gratitude and hope. Jalaluddin Rumi, the 13th century poet and Sufi, asked, "Are you jealous of the ocean's generosity? Why would you refuse to give this love to anyone? Fish don't hold the sacred liquid in cups. They swim the huge, fluid freedom." May this be our experience as well.